So today I'm welcoming Paul Vander, who I'm really excited to have onto the Meaning Forge. I think a lot of our work kind of synergizes and we kind of feed off of each other in some ways, more or less. He's a direct influence to the Meaning Forge, and I can't wait to get into this. So just a quick overview. Paul Vander is a pastor at Livingstone's Christian Reformed Church. In addition to being a pastor, he is a community builder, and this is where he excels. His community expands beyond just Livingstone's to the Paul Vander YouTube channel, then from a YouTube channel to a Discord server community called Bridges of Meaning. His focus is on tackling the hard questions in life, religion, and culture. So without any further ado, let's get into this. Welcome, Paul, to the Meaning Forge.
Those are impressive graphics.
I appreciate it.
You're impressed.
There we go. Perfect.
Oh, good. Well, I hope I can live up to the graphics.
Awesome. Yeah, the graphics are nothing. Maybe one day I'll get sponsored by them, but I just use the templates, and the templates are it's somebody makes them, and then I just sit there and just plug in a few things. So wow. That's all it takes.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
So
I just have, hi, this is Paul.
Perfect. So Paul, welcome to the Meaning Forge. And again, I am thrilled to have you on because there are some previous episodes. I would always say you have to know a person's story, where they come from, before you kind of get into some of this other stuff. And that is a direct, me directly quoting you almost in many of your random interviews, and you also do those things. So welcome to the Meaning Forge.
Oh, it's my pleasure to be here today.
So first thing I would like to ask is, who is Paul, and where does Paul Vander kind of come from? Like where did he grow up at, and how has he come to be so far?
Well, I was born and raised in Paterson, New Jersey, and my father was a minister in the Christian Reformed Church. He was called to Paterson, his first job right out of school, to take what had been a little rescue mission type operation by some Dutch Calvinist Christian Reformed churches in Paterson and turn it into a standalone church. The churches that had been doing this joint ministry knew that at some point it should transition into a church. And so his job was to do that. And he spent 36 years there. So of those 36 years, 18 of those years were my growing up years in Paterson. And so Paterson was a big part. My father's ministry, the church. We in the Christian Reformed Church, we often went to Christian school, which was by our denomination, sort of by parents actually of the church in the area. So that really was my formation. It was highly multicultural in terms of there was, it was Black America. It was also Dutch Calvinism. It was also New Jersey. And Paterson has always been sort of a lower working class melting pot. And the Dutchmen that comprised the New Jersey segment of the Christian Reformed Church were also sort of blue collar. So it's these influences were deep in me, and they've, the older I get, the more I can see how that formation, along with the other experiences I've had in life, have brought me to be who I am today.
That's awesome. And so, what's a significant memory of you in that community that kind of stands out?
There's so many. Boy, I don't know if there is a definitive memory that would sum up, my years of growing up. What really, my father was never a directive person in my life. He wasn't. There are some fathers, you see him on TV and movies, that, you know, give these little pearls of wisdom or have these sayings and, you know, tell their sons what to do and are very directive. My father was never that way at all. In fact, I think probably earlier in my life, I probably blamed him for not being directive enough. At this point, however, I can very much see that he did shape me just by being who he was. And he and his values, and obviously my mother too, and her values, they deeply imprinted upon me in some ways without a lot of, you know, overt direction or in, you know, what seemed like intention. There certainly was intention behind it. And so that really perspectively, just having seen the choices that my parents made in their lives of serving the people in the church, of the community, and making that the focus of their energies and lives, that's really what imprinted strongly on me. And that this was how one ought to spend their life, in contrast to pursuing amusements, getting rich, these kinds of things, which people often do. So I would have to say, and that's not a specific memory, it's much more what I sort of glean from my memory of my growing up with my parents.
That's fine. And that's great too. Actually, that's really good, because sometimes like people will get bogged down like, well, here's the particular memory. In some cases that works, or it's a series of memories, but the essence is like, I do understand. And I kind of already, because I'm somewhat familiar with your work, I see where that's kind of starting to already pure. And so I thought it was really interesting though. You said that you kind of, your father was never directive. He kind of gave you like an open area to kind of go. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. And then you had like this rebellion to that, but that idea was imprinted. So could we explore maybe how you got to enacting that idea of serving people in the community, that in developing what you are today?
I think it was, you know, it was never something that was sort of forced on me as an obligation. And I guess that's partly what I mean by directive. Mm-hmm. But I think what was imprinted on me was that it was an honor and a pleasure to serve those who are in need and those who struggle. And there's a joy in that. And it's not a shallow happiness. It's, you know, to use some Jordan Peterson language, it's a deep, meaningful pursuit of life. And it's a deeply meaningful life. And the background for that was, of course, the church that my father helped to form, which very much embodied that. And so, you know, there were a rich cast of characters that I grew up with, you know, them being adults often, and some were children, you know, peers along with me. But, you know, and again, thinking back on it, I went to church with drug users and recovering drug users, with people who had severe mental illness, and so would sometimes do some really crazy things. And as a kid, you just watch this and you think, you don't know it's even so crazy because you just don't know enough. But all of this stuff eventually impresses upon you. And when after years, I found myself, in some ways seemingly accidentally, quite unintentional for me, ministering in a similar context to what my father did, I found myself finding joy and meaning in doing similar work, even though probably in my late teenage, young adult years, that wouldn't have, I wouldn't have imagined me doing that. That wasn't what I thought I would want to do.
That's really so. There's something here that I would like to understand a little bit more, is because I guess, what was it that you were doing during that intermission before what was revealed, like before revealing, hey, like I really, like, this is what I should be doing. What was that journey like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, again, looking back on it, when I went to college, for example, I had no idea what I wanted to do after college. And I think part of that was actually because of the lack of direct intentionality, or, even coercion, that some parents, this is what's important. This is what's important. My father was never that way. And so I'm very high in openness, and I'm very low in negative emotion. And so I tend to like a lot of things. And people will sometimes ask me, what's your favorite food? And it's usually, I don't know, whatever's in front of me. And what's your favorite thing to do? I don't know. I like doing lots and lots of things. So when I got to college, I was a little bit lost. And so I was in engineering, I was in math, I eventually settled in history. But then after history, then I still had, once I decided I wanted to go to seminary because I enjoyed religion and theology. But even then, I did not want to settle into parish ministry. And I had decided that I was at that point dating a woman who wanted to go into overseas mission work. And so I thought, well, that would be a good thing, because I sort of thought that pastoring an unimportant local church was an unimportant thing to do. So I had all the same assumptions about status and importance that anyone else would have. And I had all kinds of ideas that I think basically from modernity, that intentional programming will elicit results that fix problems. And what really broke me of that was, so after seminary, my wife and I went to do missionary work in the Dominican Republic. And I then was working with mostly Haitian pastors who were illegal in the Dominican Republic. And they had the best education among them was usually a grade school education. And so here I find myself, and I think, oh, I've got all this education. I love books. I love ideas. I love doing all this kind of thing. And here I'm working with people who are barely trying to survive. And most of the issues that they are dealing with are survival issues. And church then is a big component about how, in fact, they can endure the suffering that they are undergoing. Most of the people I worked with were desperately poor. And part of what I realized from that part of my life was that I didn't have any answers for them. And a lot of the fancy theology that I thought was important and interesting that I had learned in my seminary education after college was of not a lot of use to them. And I also figured out that for all of the work that I was doing, and I had 6 or 7 colleagues who had similar education from me, most of what we were going to accomplish with these people was by no means going to radically transform the lives of the people we were working with. And that then gave me a very sober assessment of, well, what is important? What should we do? And yeah, and so that gave me I don't want to say a cynicism, although I can say at times I am tempted by cynicism, but that sort of gave me a sober assessment of what the tools on the shelf of betterment that this world tends to bring to its problems are of severely limited capacity. And then I have to ask hard questions about, okay, well, what on earth am I doing as someone who's trained in religion and theology? What can I do for people? And I don't mean, and I mean people who have needs and suffer and all of those kinds of issues. So, and at that point, then my father's work and the value of my father's work made so much more sense to me. But it took years for me to see that. It'd be nice if I had some moment and, you know, something like you see in the movies, but it's, you know, I am now in my late 50s. I've been here at this church for 25 years. I was in the mission field for almost 7 years. You learn things as time goes by, and the events in your life, the importance of the events in your life look different, and what you value as important changes as you go through these different periods of life. And I think in this little corner of the internet, you know, a big piece of our project, I think, is in fact wisdom. And, you know, my definition of a healthy culture, and perhaps of wisdom itself, is giving to people what they have not yet been able, giving to the people something of value that they have not had time enough in their lives to accumulate. And I think classically, traditionally, that's why in Spanish, ancianos, elders, you know, that's why old people were valued, because old people had wisdom that they could share with the young, and the young could take that wisdom for their betterment.
In all seriousness, yes, I agree with that. And I think that's really interesting. And then I had an old guy joke in there, but I decided not to do that.
I don't mind old guy jokes. But part of the issue is that the world is changing so fast that the young, it's not stupid for the young to look at the old and say, you don't understand. And they're right to a degree. And so the young have to figure out what the old know and what the old don't know. And so that's a tricky thing.
It's just one more area I kind of want to dial in on just a little bit here before we move on into the hammer. And that is you said you spent, correct me if I'm wrong, 7 years in the mission field and then 25 years in the church, like in a
regular church. In the current church that I'm in here. Yeah.
What has been, and I have to be careful how I word this now because it's not always moments and stuff, but if you have a moment or you have a significant event, I'd love to hear it, or if there's an essence of a significant event from your time in the church, I'd love to hear that as well. Either or is fine.
You know, I think one of the things that has impressed me about the church chapter of my life, I came to this church. This church was in many ways an institution in crisis. It had 15, 20 years of unproductive conflict. It had, and then when I came, within about 6 or 8 months of me coming, that conflict then started being directed at me. And I was, naive in some ways, but I think the imprinting of my father afforded a wisdom that I had not earned in how I responded to a lot of that conflict, because it would have been tempting for me to placate the people that were making a lot of noise and being very upset with me, which had been what most of the other pastors had done with that group of people. Instead, I sort of deferred to the known structure of the church and the process of the church and said, you know, here's 2-3 families who are upset, and they can be upset if they want to. I don't, you know, it's not that I don't care, but the church isn't going to change its direction because these 3 families are upset. And the church had always changed its direction when those families had been upset. So when then those families left the church, I looked around and everyone else was sort of panicky about, this is a new thing that we've done. And I kind of looked at them and said, okay, but we're going to move forward. And I probably didn't appreciate all of the ramifications of those events, but we did move forward. And actually what happened in that conflict was, I think, vital for the future of the church, because the kinds of interpersonal dynamics that had been driving the church in an unhealthy way for a considerable amount of time were then finally broken, and the church could basically get on with doing the ministry that it should always have been doing, ministry to the neighborhood, ministry to people, and stop playing a lot of other unhealthy games. And again, it wasn't until later in retrospect that I could look back on those chapters and recognize, okay, I had been afforded wisdom that I wasn't even conscious of, but I had watched my father in ministry for so long that, in fact, my instincts had been honed by him, and I didn't even know it. It was the first printing, and it was a good printing. And so then after I had participated in it, I could then reflect on how I had responded. There's some chapters in later years that I didn't always respond well and would pay a price for them too. But again, it's if you get a good first draft in, it really helps you not necessarily succeed, but not screw up too disastrously. Yet at the same time, you should never waste your disasters, because in almost every disaster there's something to be learned. And so when you do screw up, learn from it. And that's a lot of life is in there.
That is, I liked how you went through like the dealing with conflict to almost kind of leading into the unknown. And then, hang on, I have to kind of gather some of my thoughts here. Leading into the unknown, and then realizing in that journey, either, during and after the fact, that, hey, there's something here that I have that was kind of given to me. And that's useful. And that to me, there's something there. And I definitely kind of want to revisit some of that in the sword, or not the sword, but in the crown. Okay. And that's leadership, which is always a topic that can get people talking.
Yep. Yep.
So.
Yep.
All right, so welcome to the hammer. Yes, the hammer. You see mine behind me? It's on this side. So this is kind of like the idea of Thor's hammer, right? And one of the big things that I always ask myself is, why is Thor always destroying with the hammer? Right? Or something to that effect, when a hammer is also used to build, because we see that dichotomy with Braun. Oh, that's not Braun the Builder, is it? It's not. It's the guy who helps build the wall for the, I want to say the Aesir. And so then they trick him, and then that's how you get Sleipnir and a few other people. So really kind of got me thinking, and of course the Bifrost and a few other things, and building bridges. So in here, this is where we kind of start making your sword that you will come to later embody. And we kind of talked about some of that already. We talked about the influences of your father, and we've talked about the influences of your mother, really your parents. And there's something here that I kind of want to dive into a little bit more, because I think we kind of keep alluding to it, and it's also a theme that I'm seeing in some of these interviews. Because we can talk about the materials and the attributes of, like, who is Paul? Okay, well, Paul has like openness, and some of those are attributes that, you know, are good materials, right? One of the things I want to dive into is, okay, so your father wasn't as, you know, directive, not as intentional, or he was intentional, but in a different way. And you later come to kind of see that. I guess, what are some of your thoughts on a procedure, right? In a way I relate this to is, people are like coerced and forced into certain areas or something like that, and then they regret it later, or they're grateful and they change that idea. So it's actually a mistake in the making of your sword. It's a process. So like, maybe you didn't quench it long enough, or maybe you didn't do X, Y, and Z the right way. So what are some of your thoughts on how important the procedure was into making who you are today?
The procedure of
allowing you the space to explore these ideas, because like you went off and you did all your other things. And this is the first time in this show where I've had somebody say, I did all of these things. Yes. Now, you did allude to a bitterness earlier, but you did all of these things, and then you didn't realize on the back end, like, this is a good first draft.
Yeah.
Versus a bad first draft.
Yeah. You know, my father's, I don't even know how intentional it was. I think it's really hard to know. You know, my father died in 2013, quite unexpectedly, of a heart attack. The rest of us in the family, my mother tended to be the one who was more intentional, more direct. I often referred to him as a babe in the woods in some ways. He was at his, you can find my eulogy for him on deep in the archives of my channel, that I gave a eulogy in Massachusetts where he died, and I eventually gave one in Patterson. They were from the same. They were a little different, but the first one wasn't recorded. There was an error in the AV booth. The second one was recorded, and I have it on my channel. I should probably edit it out and post it. It was good. He was a person without guile. And what does that mean? Someone with guile in the Bible is someone who can be duplicitous, someone who acts out of bitterness, someone who responds out of suspicion. Now, what that meant for him was that he was often taken. And what I mean by taken was someone would ask him for money and say, "Oh, Pastor, I'll return this, or I'll pay you back." And they never would. And my mother and I and the rest of us knew full well they weren't going to, because we had seen it. And we in some ways had a much more practical appropriation of Calvinism than even my Calvinist pastor father. He thought the best of people, and he did that sometimes naively, and it looked naive, but the deeper you got to know him, the more you understood that he actually understood that, and it was for him much more of a intentional allowance of people. You have this saying, give someone enough rope that they'll hang themselves, and that was very much my father. And so there is a deep and abiding assumption of grace in the world that such people work with. And some people do, in fact, take all that rope and hang themselves. And others of us will get ourselves tangled up, but learn from those tangles. And I would say that was probably more myself, because in later years, because I didn't have an imprintation of directness, when I became a father, when I became a pastor, a lot of that was also sort of intuitive in me. And so, the tangles of my life, the failures of my life, my failures as a husband, my failures as a father, my failures as a minister and as a pastor, there are a few things that can teach us quite so vividly as failure. And so I would say that is part of a very sort of an invisible hammer of my father's method in me. And I think I have practiced that with my children. And we'll see what happens with them. People often will ask me for parenting advice, and I will usually tell them the same thing. I will say, be the person you want your child to become. And because I think that's some of the best advice, or I wouldn't give it if I didn't think it was the best advice, because children evaluate what they see, and they will evaluate it for decades as they themselves pass through stages in life and revisit the consequences of their own actions, which either are sort of in alignment with what they saw their parents do, or contrastive to what they saw their parents do. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's where your question took me.
Works for me, actually.
Okay.
Actually, it took me to a great journey to where I was kind of wanting to go as well, which was asking about family, and you answered it already. So I appreciate that. That's awesome. Now, on the last comment you kind of mentioned, you mentioned they compare this for the rest of we'll say time for them, right? And they're acting those things out, and they're either going to act in accordance or act outside of accordance. Was there ever something or a series of events or something like that, again, in essence, that where you acted outside of this and of this framework? I kind of want to call it a framework, if that's okay, where you regretted doing that?
Oh yeah. It's so hard, and I don't know if I can contextualize that in terms of my parents, though. When I think about,
it's all about you.
yeah. When I think about failures as a husband, failures as a father, those are usually the most difficult things to bear, in terms of, when I didn't love or give attention sufficiently or properly to, my wife or my children. And that, that was something that my father actually later in life regretted, because when he, as a younger man, when I was younger, because younger people usually that's when you have babies. He was not very present in the home, and he eventually had to repent of some, he wanted to save Patterson. And I had to learn, I got some of those lessons learned in the Dominican Republic early, because for as difficult that Patterson was in many respects for many of the African Americans who had moved there up during the Great Migration, the Dominican Republic was a few levels lower in terms of the sort of existential crisis that many of the Haitians had been living in. And I learned fairly quickly that I was not going to be able to fundamentally transform those communities in a short order in any way. Just like my father, couldn't save Patterson. So there's a certain amount of insanity about giving children to the young. There's a certain wisdom to it, because children are an enormous, children are enormously needy, and it's good to have healthy, energetic parents to keep up with them. Sometimes I see grandparents raising children. Grandparents have wisdom. And ideally, I think, and this is something that we've lost in our culture, you can have children would know their grandparents well. And that's something that my children didn't, because my parents are on the East Coast and I've lived now on the West Coast. And before that, I lived overseas. So I have to ask myself, if my wife and I are not going to have any more children, but if I were to have to raise another child, would I do better the second time around? I don't know, because I certainly have more wisdom now, but I have less energy now. So these are hard questions.
Well, we both like to tackle the hardest questions around. So those are the ones that we find the most meaningful. I had a professor a long time ago in German history class for me. He said, life is not about the answers, it's about the questions, the pursuit of questions. And so that kind of was a resounding thing with me. And I don't think I disagree with anything you said. That's for sure. All right, so the sword. I love where this conversation is going, because we're talking about fatherhood, and we're talking about being a parent and realizing some of the life lessons in this conversation, and I love it. So thank you for that. And I think we're kind of teetering on some important ideas here, and one of those is, well, if I'm older and I do it again, chances are I'm not going to be nearly as successful. Or I may be more successful. We don't know, because the energy factors is huge. One of the things we were talking about kind of earlier is technology and wisdom, and I think it kind of starts to kind of come in as we start to wield the sword and begin to kind of act out some of these things. And I definitely want to start within the family, because we deal with technology today and how that's changing the dynamic in a way. And and that technology is almost a young man's game, as we were kind of talking about earlier, because sometimes you just can't keep up with the constant increases in technology or changes in technology. So I guess as a parent, how would you tread some of, maybe we'll start with that. How would you tread some of the dangers of being a parent with technology today?
Technology is so broad. My wife, I think, had, when my children were younger, had better intuitions in terms of limiting screen time. I was the one who would, you know, like to have the kids play computer games because I played computer games. And my wife was always sort of, you know, fewer screens, less screens. And that was good. We, you know, in that we tried to strike a balance, because technology is something that children are going to have to grow up into and learn the use of, both in terms of being able to wield it, but also limit their use of it. And it's that, you know, there's so many things in life that are useful in their proper measure, but if outside their proper measure, destructive. And so, you know, my wife, I think, had probably some better intuitions on that, while I made sure that everything ran, and that when the children, for example, were in high school and had to write papers and do reports, there was a printer in the house and a functioning printer. The neighbors would always come over. The neighborhood kids would always come over and print their papers at my house, because their printers they didn't have any of the equipment. So, and I always made sure that all worked. But the speed of technological transformation has been so rapid. We have not had a chance to accumulate wisdom. We don't know what these screens, what our social media networks, what the computer games, we don't know what this is doing to us or where it will lead. I look back, my parents did not limit, let's say, our television time. And Grim Grizz made a comment in his conversation with Sevilla, you know, your regularly scheduled programming. And when he said that, I saw the two natures of that word. Yeah, I was being programmed by ABC, NBC, and CBS. And I sat there willingly for my regularly scheduled programming. And I think back now on some in my extended church community who either if they had a television, they kept it in the closet and the parents would only bring it out for special occasions, or they made sure there was no television in the house at all. And those strange children read tons of books and actually did very well in school. And for all of their years without a television, didn't seem too worse for the wear, frankly. So, yeah, we don't know. We don't know where these things are leading us.
I would agree with that, and I think I kind of want to shift gears a little bit too, because one of the things that I and this kind of this technology and wisdom thing is, I would say there's immense wisdom in what you've done and the way you built community, right? Because like we can look at it from this perspective, right? The technology that we have, we could just keep it in that small square or a small area in a physical space, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. Or we can expand it into the Internet of Things and connect more people through your Discord, for example, your Discord server. I mean, your Discord server, I love it. And by the way, it's Bridges to Being Discord. It will be in the link below. So I guess, what are your thoughts on how did you wield that appropriately?
Well, first of all, it was Joey and Job and Tyler and a bunch of people that I had spoken with. They actually wield that Discord server. So when there are a lot of people would often tell me, "Oh, you should write a book." It's because I'm interested in ideas and I like words, and I don't write poorly. And I would think about that. But I noticed that many common people weren't reading books. And if in fact, I had written a book, people in my church and my family would likely politely buy it just because they wanted to show support to me. But I don't know how deep that book would sink into them. And I think that was and I saw that as being a function of technology. I knew videos would be different. I didn't know how different they would be. And so I have long played with technology. And when I saw what Jordan Peterson was doing on YouTube, and maybe not even so much necessarily what he was doing on YouTube, but he was experimenting with YouTube, and he used that language. And seeing what it would do, I thought, oh, let me play with YouTube and see what it would do. And it did a lot more than I ever would have imagined it would do. And so then I would sort of take things one step at a time. I knew a lot of people were watching Jordan Peterson, and I knew that was having an impact on people. I could tell that from Reddit, from comment sections, but then I thought, I'll bet you a lot of these people are alone watching YouTube. And I wonder if they'd like to have a conversation, even a virtual one, with someone or with others as they watch. And so that's where I came up with with the idea behind my commentary videos. And the commentary videos led to conversations via email or Zoom or Skype or here at Living Stones face to face. And I've just kept developing that as we went. In other words, if we're going to gain wisdom from this technology, we're going to have to play with it. And play is the right word. And like this morning, I posted 2 very short little videos that were clips from the impromptu live stream that I did yesterday. And so I've been playing with the Discord server, and I've been playing with all of these things. And at this point in my life, I think it's a good time for me to play with these things because my children are now pretty much out of the house. My career is pretty much set. I've got about 10 years before retirement. So I've got I can take some risks now that I probably couldn't take when I was 30 or 35. And so let me play with technology and let me play with it publicly. And that's been important too, so that people can watch how I play with it and they hopefully can learn both from my successes and my mistakes. And so that's been behind a lot of what I've done. And so
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I keep starting new things because I want to see what happens with them. And I want to see then what other people do. And so the part of my channel, I feel I didn't start the Discord server. Joey and Job and people who were younger than myself, who knew that technology better than I did, they started it. I learned from them. And then I had some new ideas about how I could use it. I look at Karen Wong and the Meaning Code, and I look at what you're doing here, and I look at what Grim Grizz is doing, and Chris Bacow and Chad the Alcoholic, and I see all of us playing with this. Now, again, for some of them, they're playing in a different point in their life. I remember at one point, one of my sons asked me, he says, do you think he was playing around with a little newsletter. He was doing some political commentary or at least some sifting news sources. And he said, what do you think I should be on YouTube? And he was about 28 years old at that point. I said, probably not, because you don't know, and he doesn't know this yet. You don't know what you're going to think when you're 50. It will definitely be in continuity with who you are now. But I remember Tim Keller talking about why he didn't start writing books until he was in his 50s. He said, anything I would have written in my 20s, I'd want to burn now. anything in my 30s and 40s probably wasn't ripe. And that little word gave me a lot of wisdom, because it said it takes a while to mature. And, you know, fame in your 20s, it's a bad time for fame. We see it all the time. Fame in your 30s and 40s, you probably got a little better chance to handle it. But even, you know, fame and fortune, if it finds you, good luck, because it can really mess you up. And not that I've achieved fame or fortune from my YouTube experimentations, but these issues of audience capture, they're very real. And it's, you know, I can afford to play with it now in ways that I couldn't have 20 years ago. And so I'm glad I'm here where I am here and now, and I wasn't back then.
There's nothing frozen.
Okay.
Got to think about that. That's really good. I can relate to that on multiple levels. Because I'm not really, probably half your age, give or take. And there's gonna be things that I know I say here that will be wrong, and then, you know, 20 years from now, when I look at this, I'm gonna probably go, oh my God. And that's why I think I'm gearing this towards a more interview style, right? So still enjoying this conversation, Paul. Thank you so much. Really, really thank you. One of the things I'm kind of dialing on, and then I'll get into my two famous questions for this pin. So this is a different pin section, a different pin conversation, because I think this really does relate. We've kind of been talking about serving people, the community, that imprinted strongly on you. You're acting that out. How we kind of are using technology and wisdom, and where that is in time and space. And not only that, but also like raising, I don't want to say raising kids, but like here at meaningforge, it's all about forging individuals. And I would even say that is a process as well. And that's part of that. So the pen, in a way, is a close cousin of the sword. I think they're the same substance. They're just one you choose to write, and others you choose to use differently. Same questions can be asked for those. And one of the things I think is interesting is, in our last segment, we were talking about doing it publicly and asking yourself where in time, and this is more of an implicit question, right? Not explicitly, but asking yourself, where in time and space do I want to be writing these things down, or talking about these things, or leaving this footprint for someone to find and study? And I guess it's good for people to change. I think that's a good thing. I think when you see people that don't change, that's a sign that maybe something isn't wrong, or maybe they figured it out. The question could go either way. What I would like to kind of dial in on is this idea that actually, one of the things that I'm kind of wrestling with in the conversation is, when is it the right time to write and leave that mark? Because I'm a huge fan of Hamilton, right? And that's probably more of a direct representation of where the pen comes from. Because I agree with you, right? The wisdom comes later. However, if you don't sit there and you lay it on the line, you start writing. I mean, Hamilton was a prolific writer during most of his life. Granted, he was bashful. So when is it appropriate to write and to share and to do it publicly? And why is that important?
So before my YouTube channel, I had a blog, which I still have. People can go on it and read anything that I wrote back to 2009, 2008. Before then, a lot of the other blogs and websites that I'd played around with before then are gone, just because maybe you can find it on the Wayback Machine or something like that. I think you have to always write. And you know, it might seem contradictory to what Tim Keller had said and what I just said, what he said. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to write. I think you have to always write, because you don't, writing forms you and shapes you, and it's a discipline to work out your thoughts. And it's a, very old, low-level technology. I think if I had to do it all over again, I might have kept a journal better in my life. There were sporadic periods of my life where I journaled, and then I didn't. My wife, for example, she has her grandmother's diary, and her grandmother didn't write a whole lot each day, but just a few comments. And my wife's father was killed in a car accident when my wife was 13. And so then, of course, my wife, when she received her grandmother's diary after her grandmother had died, looked up that date, and just the journal entry is basically, Lyle was killed in a car accident today. And part of what we do when we write is, as Vervaeke would call, self-transcendence. We're able to sort of sit back apart from ourselves and look at ourselves. And whether or not the world, whether or not you write anything that's actually worthwhile for anybody else to read, it's still a good practice, because if you devote yourself to that discipline for a long period of time, you will get good at it, and you will get better at it, and you will grow in wisdom and self-knowledge. And, I like, Peterson's little aphorisms about these things, becoming a monster. And of course, people react to that. Oh, monsters are horrible. Well, yeah. But what he means is that you'll become powerful and dangerous. Oh, no, dangerous isn't it? No. I think Jordan's interpretation of the meek shall inherit the earth is exegetically all wrong. But his little aphorism, I think, is a good one. It just doesn't pertain to that text, which is, no, you ought to be. I think what Peterson is really talking about is kavod, which, glory and weight are the same word in Hebrew. And this is a weighty subject. This is a person of substance. In our maturity, we ought to grow up to be consequential people. The psalmist, like a tree planted by streams of water, not moved easily. And so that is what we should do with our time, is to mature and to grow substantive. And writing is a tremendous way to do that. And not everybody is a writer. And so that's, again, part of the reason that I opted for videos at this point in my life instead of writing. Mm-hmm. Because, but the downside of my videos is that if someone wants to reach into them, it's very difficult, because by the nature of video. Whereas if I, in fact, had been writing is much more accessible. It's easy to look at, a table of contents or an index or something. And here Paul talks about this, and you can go right to that paragraph and read the paragraph or read the chapter and get it right away. Whereas someone who wants to get into who I am, well, here's a couple thousand hours of video. Have at it.
Well, sometimes that's just the way it is. As Jonathan Vervaeke says in The Meaning Crisis, if someone's going to try and tell you the meaning, like meaning in the world and stuff like that in 2 hours, they're bullshitting you. This is a long topic and you need to know the background. You need to go through this 50-hour lecture in order to freaking understand it. And it is rough. You could do it in 25 if you listen to things twice the speed.
Good luck.
I did it. I had to pay I had to make sure I was paying more attention though. That was the downside. Like I had to really, really focus in, and I was taking notes and all other fun stuff. But other than that, great series, highly recommended. I've recommended it before. So I really like that. And what I kind of would like to kind of say on that is it's just like, it's why I say the pen and the sword are the same. Like I put them intentionally on, I actually implicitly, but later on I figured out why I did it on the same plane, right? If you look at the symbol, it's hammer, sword, pen. And the reason why is because you have to wield the pen. You have to be just as careful wielding the pen as you do wielding the sword, because you still write on people's heart and you write on the community. And that is just, it is just something that you have to be careful with. You can still kill somebody with a pen.
Yeah.
And not just talking like stab, stab, stab. Maybe you stab them metaphorically in the heart, which is I think is a lot more damaging, honestly. And so I thank you for sharing that and walking through that. So thank you so much. And now the fun question. And yes, has to be only one thing.
Okay.
All right. One thing.
I'll try my best.
All right. 2,000 years from now, there's an archaeological dig, and it is over your house, or wherever you want it to be, like the house or the church. Let's just say it remains somewhat intact and stuff like that. And then they go in, and what is the one thing you want them to find that will capture the essence of Paul Vander Klay?
Because, I mean, you frame it as an object.
Yes.
Boy, that's really hard. That's so hard.
I do it intentionally.
I'm not sure what you're going to come up with. I'm not sure what I'm going to come up with.
That's what matters. Let's just see where it takes you.
I'll say a discarded cup of soup. A discarded cup of soup. The little styrofoam things, you know?
Okay. I got to know why.
Well, yesterday I wrote on Twitter a story. There was a woman who, I didn't know it, had been living for a few days in one of our sheds here. It's unlocked, and I really got to get a lock for it. She could get in there because I was cleaning out junk that the child care center had left. And, she had taken up residence over at the corner of the building here, which I knew wouldn't last because I know that the downspout floods that area whenever it rains. And it was a woman and not a man, and that's a significant difference in terms of people on the street. And a pastor had stopped me over at the corner because he wants to rent from us, and so I was talking to him, and I saw a car stop and a woman get out and bring the woman at the corner some food, and I saw another one of the homeless guys over there paying some attention to her, and she was new and I didn't know who she was. Anyway, so then when I got a text from the other pastor who's here on site, said, I found a woman in this shed and told her she had to leave. I said, okay. So then I saw all this stuff by the gate, and I knew the gate was locked, so she couldn't get it out. And so I went outside, and there she was. I said, "Oh, Pastor, I want to get my stuff out, but the gate is locked. Could you open the gate so I can get my stuff out?" She said, "Sure." I said, "Oh, before that, let's come on inside. And do you want something to eat?" "Yeah, I'd love something to eat." So I made maybe not a cup of soup, maybe a can of soup, a can of Campbell's soup, and popped it open, put it in a dish, warmed it up in the microwave, put it in a little tray for her, set her down, and just because in my experience, then people start to talk and they start to share their lives. Because when I first met her, she seemed more clear-headed than a lot of the people that wind up right outside my door. And she just told me her story, and she told me how she bragged about the fact that the first child she had, she was able to keep that child until that child was 5 years old before Child Protective Services took her away. Because the next child they took away at 2 years, and the one after that at 4 months, and the one after that at 2 months. And how long have you been on the street? 3 years. Why? Where did you last live before you're on the street? Well, with my father. He died. And she told me that story. And so I trade stories for a can of soup. And and for her, I would love to record these stories and share them on YouTube. I would love to do that, but there are some real reasons why in most cases it's not appropriate, because many of the people who are right here on the street can't really give informed consent in terms of what sharing a story on YouTube might mean for them. But I can more easily protect them and disguise them, and we're in the section of the pen, disguise them by telling their story on Twitter or on a blog or on Facebook or something like that. Maybe with a story, or maybe with a picture or two that captures something of who they are, and share that story with the world. Because this woman is 40 years old and she's schizoaffective. She's got a criminal record. She's got 4 children out into the world, and she stays in this neighborhood because her children live near here, and she gets a chance to see them now and then. And having known such people now, and having seen my father minister to people in situations like this, she will not live long. And she's made it to 40, but on the street, she says, I got into that shed because when I'm on the street, everybody's pressuring me for sex. And I can understand that. And unlike some of the women on the street, that I'm amazed that someone will exchange sex for drugs with them. This was not an unattractive woman, and so it's harder for her. And she talked to me about her drug use and how she was adopted, and she assumes that her mother probably did drugs. And, I think of Don Quixote and Aldonza, Dulcinea, and I look at this woman and I think, it is stories like this for which Jesus came to die. And, she's definitely schizoaffected. And the longer we talk, the more crazy things got, which I'm very used to. But this is not the way the world should be. And there are 4 children out there who hopefully have a little bit better grasp on sanity than this woman does. And hopefully they don't repeat the drug addiction and the various things that this woman has. But I'd like to see that chain. I'd like to see that intergenerational chain end. And for whatever those children of this woman wind up doing, they're now ages 20 to 7, 4 children. This is still their mother. I regularly sit with homeless people and give them a chance to call their parents, and if their parents are alive and if the relationship hasn't been severed. And it's a wholly sobering thing to sit down and listen to a parent talk to their child that they still love, that they know the child is deeply lost in some ways, and there's probably no way to rescue them. And so I hope they dig up a can of soup, and they probably, this is just a can of soup. This is not a holy relic. But for me, that can of soup is a holy relic, because for that can of soup, I purchased a story from a woman that I was able to share on Twitter and now here with you, because there's something sacred about that life that, for a whole lot of good reasons, this world does not value. But, and this is where Christianity comes in, because it was for people like this that the Son of God came to this world and poured out his life. And so, yeah, I guess a can of soup. That's what I want them to find.
That's it's really beautiful in its own right. It's I don't know if I'm using the words right, because I'm kind of pulling right now from like the old ideas of comedy and tragedy. Yeah. So thank you for sharing that. And I think that normally I also like to ask a question like, what do you want the essence of you to be remembered by? So kind of the same idea, except this time it's the essence.
Yeah, I'd like. Sarah Groves has a beautiful song that I love. You know, he is the sun and we are the moon. The moon has no light of its own, but always reflects the light of the sun. And I hope I can reflect the light of Christ to a world, a cruel world that that does not value image bearers of God as they should be valued. So, and that I saw my father do. And I also heard, he was a preacher of the gospel. I heard him contextualize what he did. And because just helping hurting people without the context, that's good, but it's not glorious. And I want to be a glorious reflection of the God that made me.
I think I would expect nothing less. So all right. So as you get older, sometimes the crown is on your head and sometimes it's on your face.
I got a big nose. It gets caught.
Yeah. So the crown is in itself. It does mean wisdom in some regards, right? It is also the burden, right? And the way I phrase it is a burden of responsibility too. And I don't think you get, I don't think how I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. I don't think you take on a burden of responsibility. You decelerate the aging process. So there's that, and there's wisdom involved, and there's discipline involved for both the individual and, of course, for others. And what I mean by that is leadership in more ways than one, because now you are the weight of all that is really important. And I guess one of the things I want to ask, and this is not a less than heavy hitting question, is something to the effect of, when, as a leader, do you have to pull away and realize that you can't help everyone?
Well, it's when so I was sitting and talking to that woman, and she was eating her bowl of soup, and I looked outside and I saw a guy on a little bicycle ride through the parking lot, and I thought, oh, I wonder what he's up to. And then I saw him ride back, and she had her stuff right there by the gate, and he starts going, getting into her bag. And so I shoot up and I go out there, and he sees me, and I didn't take anything, and he runs away. But then, I finished up her soup, and, I would have loved to have done something to help her, but I knew that there's very little I can do. It's very little I can do. And so you send her out. So she took a whole bunch of junk from the shed, which I actually appreciate because I've been cleaning out the shed, and I should probably bless somebody else with that junk, because I get blessed with a lot of homeless junk that fills up my garbage container. But, you send her out, and it's like, out into the world she goes, and it's a cruel world. It's a dark world. And so I got like I mentioned before, I got a text from a certain individual's probation officer that right before Christmas, I brought him to the mental hospital and thought, this is probably good timing. He'll spend the holidays in here. It's probably a good thing. And he did. And now he's getting out, and he is going to make his way back to my door here, and he'll knock on the door, and we got all the street drugs out of his system, and he'll be clear-eyed and a little bit more focused. I'll have a little bit more energy to pursue some goals, but within 2 or 3 days, that'll all be shattered, and it'll be back in his old grooves. And he's going to do this in all likelihood. I hope not, but odds are he's going to do this until he dies. And in this case, I've had conversations with his father, who lives in Utah, and members of his family. I wouldn't be surprised that when he dies, I will hear about it. Most of the time, people just disappear, and I never hear from them again. So and again, this is the lesson I learned in the Dominican Republic. I'm just one person. At the end of the movie Schindler's List, Oscar Schindler is going through, and if I'd sold the car, I could have saved 5 people. And we are not saviors of the world. We're human beings. And the Heidelberg Catechism, one of the doctrinal statements of my denomination, talks about the fact that in order to save us, Jesus needed to be both man and God. And I think that's right. So Jesus tells his disciples, you will be my witnesses. He doesn't say, you will save the world and I will show you how to. That's not what he says. He says, you will be my witnesses. He is the Savior. We are the witnesses to the Savior. We get to participate, but we're just human beings. And so that's, you resign. You have those moments of resignation where my efforts are insufficient even to save this one other person. And how often don't I sit with a parent who has a child who is an alcoholic or a drug user, and or has come down, in their late teens, early 20s with schizophrenia or a bipolar or something like that. And the parent has tried everything to save their child. And I'll just have to say to the parent, you can't save her, and you have to stop trying. You have to figure out how to love her, but you have to stop trying to save her, because you can't. And for a parent, that's really hard, but it's true. So, and every king knows that.
Yeah, and that's just something that I've asked leaders all like everywhere. How do you know when to cut somebody? How do you know when when it is time? And sometimes does it, correct me if I'm wrong, but does it sound dangerous when you sit there and say, no, that never happens. You have to continually give, or just lay in all the resources to prevent that demise.
The giving needs to take different forms. So most of my children were lifeguards in the city of Sacramento pools.
Mm-hmm.
When you go out to rescue someone who is drowning, you need to make sure they don't grab you, because you will both drown.
Exactly.
You need to grab them in a way that they can't grab you, so you can drag them. Same thing with, the mask drops in the airline. They tell the parents, put your mask on first. And I also deal with, people who are, let's say someone comes down with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or something like that. I will say to the spouse, you will be of no good to them if you expend yourself sufficiently so that you're disabled too. You need to have boundaries. And I mean, parents of disabled children have to learn this. Spouses of Alzheimer's victims have to learn this. There are limits to what we can do. And if you don't know those boundaries, you will actually not be able to serve well. And so, but figuring out where those boundaries are, it's really hard. I mean, in ministry, we have something called a Messiah complex. And it's exactly this point, that you begin to imagine you are the Savior. And Christian theology says you are not the Savior. You are his witness. You are not the Savior. And it's a hard lesson to learn.
Yeah. As a leader in the Army, it's always a hard lesson to learn, and you'll never make friends by doing it.
No, because people are sure they know what you should do. And well, okay, but I'm not you, and you're not sitting in my chair. So I might make the wrong call. I do it all the time, but it's still my call to make. And then often as a pastor, I'll sit down with people, let's say someone's in a horrible marriage, and I'll say, I'm not going to tell you what to do. And the question is divorce or not divorce. I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have the agency. That's your decision. I can talk through issues with you, but the decision is yours, and I can never take that decision away from you. And you have to learn this with dealing with even, drug addicts and homeless people. I can't, that's the teaching Alcoholics Anonymous, and Al-Anon, don't try and, if you keep pouring out their bottles, you're not really helping them.
Yeah.
It's their problem. They have to stop. You might need to put them out. But
it's a hard decision to make. And so, I guess, in all of that, right, I think there's, in this, I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot with the question, because we see all of this, this hardship and sometimes leadership, and sometimes it's just not the right time for people. Like, sometimes it's a series of events before somebody finally decides, okay, the only thing I can do is just kind of, if I'm not planting the seed, I'm just nurturing the seed that's there. Yeah. And I guess, what's your biggest joy leading others and leading? And I guess really kind of what I want to look at is, earlier we were talking about dealing with conflict in the church when you took over, and then you kind of led them through the unknown. What's one of your greatest joys about leading people, I guess, and to use the biblical language here, through an exodus?
Yeah. Well, obviously, when they get to the promised land, when they, when the, I was talking to Chad, the alcoholic, the other day, and, someone who achieves sobriety and then finds, they can manage a marriage, they can keep a job, they can have a child, they can, it's glory. It's glory. I was lost, but now I'm found. I'm blind, but I can see. And so to take part in that. You know, there's a reason Jordan Peterson breaks down when people stop him on the street and says, you know, my relationship with my father was a mess and I was going nowhere, and you inspired me, and I have a job and I'm engaged. And of course he breaks down. It's utter grace. And, you know, part of why he breaks down is because, you know, certainly he had a hand in it, but he didn't steal their joy or their glory. He was able to participate in it, but he didn't take it from them. And so it's multiplied in that sense, and it's glorious. And it's the best things we can have in this fallen world.
So, Paul, thank you so much for coming on Meaningforge. And we've talked about so much stuff, and I just feel like I want to keep going and going and going, but we can't do that. So we have to. There's a time to end all good things, and that's the good news. So over this conversation, there's been some key things. We've been talking about parenting and leading and some phrases, some things that kind of stuck out in my head. And one of those is serving people in the community. Like it's just like ingrained in you from every aspect. Like if that is like what you've made yourself into being, like that is the sword that you carry and act out every single day. And then dealing with tangles, I thought was kind of a play on words for me, because like we have to be loving enough as well to kind of give people the right thing, but not do it naively, but hopefully, and I guess have faith that they'll untangle themselves. And then the next kind of area in the sword was playing with tools. And in a way, playing with the sword, playing with serving community, playing with serving people, and what that looks like. And of course you're going to fail, and of course you're going to succeed, and when you do succeed, it's absolutely glorious to use some of that language. The pen with the discarded soup, cup of soup, that's powerful. And that story is extremely, extremely prevalent, or not prevalent, but useful, because it's meaningful. And so thank you for sharing that with us. And lastly, kind of in leadership, you didn't exactly say this in this way. And one of the things I kind of picked up was giving people their agency.
Yeah.
So and that kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit, like with the sword and the pen and whatnot, and particularly with the sword, is give people a sword that they can lift themselves up, like that they can draw. And I don't want to go all the way all the time, but I have to, because this is a very King Theoden reference for me. I have a question, just a fun question. How many times in your conversations is Tolkien or C.S. Lewis referenced?
A lot. A lot. More than half. Definitely. More than half. Yeah. They were new. They worked hard on the meaning crisis in the middle of the 20th century, which were formative years. You know, I was born in the early 60s, so, you know, and they were formative. I've got copies of C.S. Lewis's books from my grandfather. So my family's been reading C.S. Lewis for 3 generations now. So.
That's beautiful. I have a Bible behind me. That's actually that one of that's from my great grandfather, if I'm not mistaken, who was a pastor nearby. So absolutely. And so like this conversation has had lots of different topics and lots of different areas, and I love it. And is there anything in this conversation that maybe that you learned about yourself, or because like I feel like I'm asking someone who's extremely introspective, a question that I may not get a lot out of, but we'll see.
I'm surprised how much I talked about my parents and my father. I didn't necessarily expect that, but you know, we are mysteries to ourselves, and part of the reason we talk to each other, and you know, I talk into YouTube, is to learn about myself. And so that was, you know, that's something that came out, and I had no idea how I was going to answer that archaeological dig question. I had no idea how that was going to answer.
It's a fun
you don't
question.
find you don't find a YouTube video in the rubble.
No, exactly. You don't. One person said they hope to find a hard drive, and that hard drive would have all of their work in it. And I was like, well, let's hope they're technologically advanced that they can read all that and decipher that. And so that's fine too. And this is just an underlying theme, I think, that really kind of speaks to this idea. So meaningforge is about forging individuals, right? And I actually receive a lot of criticism, or not a lot of, well, some criticism, because I'm only a small channel right now, that, well, you just can't make individuals. What about the community? What about the collective? What about everybody else around you? And what I see in this conversation that I'm pulling away from it is you're part of your identity as an individual is revealed to you as you serve the community. Like you actually have to go out and do that, because even if you are sitting here just doing a YouTube video that you know people just watch and don't actually engage with all the time, you're still doing that. You're still leaving a mark on the community, and the community is then also leaving a mark on you, I would say implicitly. Yeah. Because you have to have, and explicitly through comments and stuff like that. And so I really appreciate this conversation, and it's been wonderful. Are you a fan? Are you a sports fan by chance?
Not a big sports fan. I have been in different, you know, when I was a kid, I loved the Yankees. I like playing fantasy football with my friends and family. So I follow football to the degree that it facilitates the fantasy football game. But
okay, what was your best season in fantasy football?
Oh, it's too many years ago.
So you're like a Detroit Lions.
Yeah, I had some good years because I knew that everybody but the running backs on the Patriots were going to do well. And this year, I rode Tom Brady pretty hard this year, and he had a good season. He's been a good source of fantasy football points. But a key week in my season this year is when he played New Orleans, and it was a terribly low scoring game. I both had Alvin Kamara and Tom Brady, and that was it. That was it for my playoff run. It was a terrible Sunday. So
it happens. It happens.
That's what happens in fantasy football.
It's what happens in sports, because sometimes you just fail. Like things happen. Things magically start to not work.
Which is what's fun about sports. You have these teams that seem absolutely, dominant, and any given Sunday they collapse. It's a football game. It's a basketball game. I used to, when my sons played basketball, for a local high school, fun watching them play youth league sports, even if the parents don't know how to behave.
Perfect. So on my show, I don't have the last word. I prefer my guests to.
Oh, okay.
And the reason why I don't is because I like to cut out the last little part, and that is the final words. Like it's like words of wisdom, essentially. The attempt at it, and I like to frame it as you're talking to somebody right now, because it would just be you, who has watched this interview or hasn't watched this interview, just sees this clip. What is the one thing in life that you want them to have from you? And
pay attention. Be kind. Whether you believe it or not, take time to read the Bible. It is the foundational text of Western civilization, and you won't be able to understand most of the great works of the West if you don't understand that book. That's it.